phone buzzed at 2:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I'd been lying awake anyway, staring at the water stain on my apartment ceiling that looked like a wolf mid-howl. Some nights it comforted me. That night, it felt like a warning I'd arrived at too late. I picked up my phone expecting spam, a bank alert, maybe a notification from some app I'd forgotten I downloaded. What I got instead were 11 words that rearranged every memory I had ever made. "We've agreed, you're no longer family, don't contact us again." That was it, no comma after agreed. No period of reflection, no years of warnings softening the blow. Just 11 words from my mother's number at 2:47 in the morning, and the specific silence that follows a grenade after it lands, but before anyone starts screaming. I sat up, read it again. Read it a third time the way you read something that can't possibly say what it says. Then I did what any rational, emotionally stable 28-year-old would do in that situation. I called the police. Now, before you close this story and assume I completely unraveled, give me a moment, because what happened next is not the story of a person falling apart. It is the story of a person being put back together. And the man who did the putting together was 79 years old, drove a 1987 Ford pickup that sounded like it was perpetually auditioning for a demolition derby, and went by the name Grandpa Ned. But I'll get to him. First, the police. I called because the text wasn't just cruel, it was the final message in a chain of events that had been quietly terrifying me for 3 months. My parents, Carl and Diane, two people I had spent my entire life trying desperately to earn, had become involved with a group. I won't call it a cult outright, though I've since spoken to people who use that word without hesitation. I'll call it what they called it, a community of aligned values. They'd moved into a shared property in rural Tennessee. They'd handed over access to their finances. They'd slowly, methodically cut contact with anyone who raised questions. I had raised questions. Hence 11 words at 2:47 a.m. Police, as it turned out, couldn't do much. My parents were adults. They had made their choices. The officer I spoke to, a tired, kind man named Deputy Farris, sat with me on the phone for 12 minutes longer than he probably needed to, listened to everything I said, and then told me gently that unless I had evidence of immediate physical danger, his hands were tied. He gave me a number for a family advocacy organization. He told me he was sorry. He meant it. I could tell. I thanked him and hung up, and sat there in my apartment with my wolf-shaped water stain until the sun came up. I didn't sleep, I drove instead. I drove the 4 hours to Millhaven, the small Tennessee town where I'd grown up, where the streets still knew my name even if the people on them had forgotten it. I didn't have a plan. I had a gas tank and a need to be somewhere that felt real. I ended up at Ned's. Grandpa Ned was not technically my grandfather. He was my mother's uncle, my great-uncle, which made him some complicated cousin once removed type of relation that we'd all given up trying to explain at family reunions. We just called him Grandpa Ned because he was the kind of man who filled that room in your heart that grandfathers are supposed to occupy. Big hands, slow speech, a laugh that started somewhere deep in his chest and took its time arriving. He'd never joined the community. He'd been invited, I later learned. He declined in the way only Ned could decline, by saying, "I appreciate that, but I've got tomatoes coming in and I don't share well with strangers," and then ending the conversation. His porch light was on when I pulled into his gravel driveway at 6:15 in the morning. I hadn't called ahead. I hadn't been sure I was coming until I was already there. He opened the front door before I even got out of the car. Just stood there in the doorway in his flannel shirt and his work pants, holding a coffee mug, watching me walk up the porch steps. His eyes moved over my face the way hands move over something they're checking for cracks. "You look like you drove all night," he said. 4 hours, I said. "That's still all night for somebody who didn't sleep." He stepped aside and held the door open. "Come in, I'll make eggs." That was it, no questions yet, no performance of concern, just, "Come in, I'll make eggs." I sat at his kitchen table, the same table where I'd eaten hundreds of meals as a child, the one with the groove in the corner from the time my cousin Tyler tried to carve his initials and got caught. And I watched Ned move around his kitchen with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had been making breakfast for himself for decades and saw no reason to rush on anyone else's account. He put a plate in front of me, eggs, toast, sliced tomato from the garden. Then he sat down across from me with his coffee and looked at me steadily. "Tell me," he said. So I told him all of it, the group, the property, the slow disappearance of my parents into something I didn't recognize, the 3 months of increasingly strange phone calls, the text at 2:47 a.m., the police, Deputy Farris, the water stain shaped like a wolf. Ned listened the way old men who have lived through things listen, without interrupting, without flinching, without offering solutions before the problem had been fully laid out. His eyes never left my face. His coffee sat untouched. When I finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough to feel intentional. Then he said, "Your mother was always looking for something to belong to. Ever since she was a little girl, she'd latch onto any group that told her she was special." He said it without cruelty, just with the weariness of someone who had watched a pattern play out over many decades. "Your daddy followed her into everything she ever wanted. That's love, I suppose. Doesn't always lead somewhere good, but it's love." I asked him what I was supposed to do. He picked up his coffee, took a long sip, set it down. "You're not supposed to do anything right now," he said. "Right now you're supposed to eat your eggs before they get cold." I laughed. It surprised me, startled up out of me like a bird that hadn't realized it was still in there. "Ned," I said. "I know," he said. "I know it hurts. I know it doesn't make sense. I know you're trying to figure out what you did wrong and the answer is nothing, and I know you don't believe that yet." He looked at me across the table with eyes that had been alive for 79 years and had seen enough to be honest without being unkind. "They're going to come back around eventually. Most people do. And when they do, you need to still be standing, which means you don't spend the next however long falling apart. You eat your eggs, you sleep, you keep living." I stayed with Ned for 4 days. We didn't talk about my parents much after that first morning. We worked in his garden. We drove around in his truck that sounded like a mechanical animal in its final season. We watched old westerns at night, the kind where the moral universe was simple and justice arrived on horseback by the 3rd act. On the 2nd day, he showed me a box in his closet. Letters, photographs, a few legal documents, a record of a falling out he'd had with his own brother 40 years ago, a fight over land and money and old wounds that had calcified into estrangement. They hadn't spoken for 11 years. Then one autumn, his brother had shown up at this same front door, same gravel driveway, and Ned had opened it and made eggs. 11 years, I said. 11 years, he confirmed. Felt like throwing away 11 years the day he showed up. Felt like getting 11 years back the day after. He tucked the letters away. Time doesn't work the way we think it does. On the 4th day, I packed my bag and stood at his door, and he pulled me into a hug that felt like being held together from the outside when you couldn't quite manage it from the inside. "You call me," he said, "not just when things are bad." "I will," I said. "I mean it, I'm old. I need things to look forward to." I drove home. The wolf on my ceiling was still there. It didn't look threatening anymore. It looked like it was just mid-stride somewhere, passing through. That was 14 months ago. My parents are still with the group. I've had 2 brief, careful phone calls with my mother since then, the kind of calls where you speak around the real things because the real things are still too hot to touch directly. She hasn't apologized for the text. I haven't pushed. We're in the strange, fragile territory of people who are technically still related, but are learning each other from the beginning. I think about what Ned said. They're going to come back around eventually. Most people do. I hold that like something I'm not sure I believe, but am not ready to put down. Ned turned 80 last month. I drove to Millhaven with a chocolate cake and ate dinner at the table with the groove in the corner. We watched a western, an old one, black and white, justice arriving on horseback, exactly on schedule. He fell asleep in his chair before the credits rolled. I sat there in his living room and listened to him breathe and thought about how the most important people in your life are not always the ones who are supposed to be. Sometimes they're the ones who open a door at 6:15 in the morning and don't ask questions and make eggs and tell you to keep living. Sometimes the person who holds your family together is not your family. Sometimes it's a 79-year-old man with a Ford pickup and tomatoes in the garden and 11 years of his own proof that time works differently than grief tells you it does. Sometimes it's Grandpa Ned. And sometimes that is more than enough.